Alright, Acts chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. That'll be our area of study tonight. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Verse 5, and he said, Who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul arose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. So we pick up with this man Saul's story again. We kind of left off on him back in Acts chapter 8 and mentioned him briefly, and then we took a little break to talk about the man Philip, and then talking about Simon, and then back to Philip, and now we're back to this man Saul. Of course, it would be at this man Saul's feet that Stephen would be would be stoned to death. He consented to this man's death. And then Acts chapter 8 picks up and tells us that he was dragging men and women away, committing them to prison, belonging to this way. So that's kind of what we see of this man Saul so far. We pick back up, and it says, Saul still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Breathing threats and murder. So a little bit of background about this man Saul. Saul would have grown up in modern-day Turkey, but would be Tarsus, Cilicia. He was a Jew, and he was born with Roman citizenship. We know that. Acts chapter 22-28 tells us he was a Roman citizen by birth, and there was 3 ways to get Roman citizenship. One was by being born into it. The other was by buying it, and the third was if you served as a slave and were freed, sometimes you could get Roman citizenship. So it's very likely that that Saul or Paul's grandfather or father was a slave to a Roman person and was given that citizenship, and then it was passed down to Saul, but through birth. Saul was raised at the feet of Gamaliel, so this man would be very well educated. There was actually like a seminary of sorts in Cilicia, and it's very likely that Saul grew up going there, and then he's being raised by Gamaliel, who is the most highly esteemed teacher of the time. He's called Rabbon, the teacher. This man is important. We talked about him back in Acts chapter 5. This man Gamaliel was just crucial. Saul would be very well respected. He would be so-called the guy, right? This is the up-and-coming star of the Jewish religion, and he's been brought up at the feet of Gamaliel. It says, Acts chapter 22, in the beginning of Acts chapter 22, in verse 3, it says, I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. So this man Gamaliel, he was raised him to be strict. He was zealous, it says, being zealous for God. This zealousness would lead him to do some terrible stuff to these early believers. So this man Saul was well educated, and he was on the rise. He was a prize student, and he's getting places. In Philippians 3, verses 4 through 6, it says, I have reason for confidence in my flesh. He says that he has more than anyone. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law a Pharisee, as to zeal a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. If anyone had things together in the eyes of the world, it's this guy, right? He is cream of the crop. He's probably thinking at this point that he's even better than his teacher Gamaliel, because look, Gamaliel was the one who defended the early church by not letting them kill them or beat them. He said, guys, we don't need to do anything. God, it'll take its toll. If this is of God, it will become something. If it's not of God, it won't become anything. It will disappear. So Gamaliel might have lost some respect in Saul's eyes, but Paul, looking at his life later on in verse 7 of Philippians 3, would say, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. In the hymn Only One Life by C.T. Studd, he says it this way: only one life, yes, only one. Soon will its fleeting hours be done. Then in that day my Lord to meet, and stand before his judgment seat. Only one life, 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. D.L. Moody put it this way: our greatest fear should not be of failure, but of succeeding at something that doesn't really matter. And Paul, later on, looking back at his life, he realizes some things. And one of those is that the only stuff that matters in his life are the things we do for God. And he's saying that this past that he's had, he counts it all as loss. What the world would consider gain, what the Jews were considering gain, what the Sanhedrin would consider gain, what Saul himself at the time would consider gain, he counts as a loss. I think it's very important. And like D.L. Moody says, he says, our greatest fear should not be a failure, but being successful at something that doesn't really matter. That's a scary thought, right? Being successful at something that isn't glorifying God or working towards God, and all of a sudden you end up in a place where you're, famous for the wrong reasons. You're in the limelight, and it really it's not for God. It's just for your own glory, and you end up wasting a lot of time, and it's a problem. So we see that Paul would address that, and he says, we count it as loss. All these amazing things that he's gotten to do, all the people and who look up to him at this point, he's so well respected here. We'll see that actually, because it says that he went to the high priest. It's very hard to get a meeting with the high priest. Like, that's not something you just do. So it shows that he had connections and he was well respected. But it says, I count it all as loss. And I think that's something for us today is, are we living in a way that, like, the only thing that matters is God? Or are we living in the world and trying to be successful at something that doesn't really matter? I think that's a very scary place to be. So Paul, breathing threats and murders against the church, went to the high priest, breathing murder, phonos in Greek, to slaughter unjustly or kill. Back in chapter 8, it says that he was committing them to prison, and now he is even more upset with these people. It seems like he might have been targeting the Hellenistic Jews like Stephen and Philip, and now he is talking about murdering them. Not just persecuting and throwing them in prison, but it seems like they're being brought to Jerusalem to be killed. And he asks in verse 2, he asked for letters to the synagogue at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he ends up in Damascus. Put yourself in the shoes of these people at Damascus. Saul has quite the reputation now. I'm sure that if you remember what happened if we see what happened in Samaria, and these people being testified to by a man Philip, who was sent away from Jerusalem because of fear of death from this man Saul, I'm sure something very similar probably happened to Damascus, because it's apparent that there is some belonging to this way, Christianity, now in Damascus. And we're not positive on how that people ended up being Christians in Damascus, but I would be willing to bet that it was kind of like that. Someone who was scattered from Jerusalem, one of the early church, started preaching and teaching the same way that Philip did in Samaria, but just in Damascus, and then God started a work and revival there. So Saul is heading there, and he gets permission from the high priest so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. And it says in verse 3, now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven shone around him. And falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? A lot to unpack here. Verse 3, it says he's on his way, he's approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven, a light that would be so bright it outshone the sun, and Saul drops to his knees instantly. And as he's falling to his knees, he hears a voice. It says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? This is very interesting. Jesus says, why are you persecuting me? Well, Saul's technically not persecuting Jesus, he's persecuting the way. But what's interesting is now Jesus came to die for us. He associates himself with his people. We're his blood-bought bride. So Jesus would really stick up for us, and he is part of us. He lives in us. So when Saul's persecuting these Christians with the Holy Spirit in them, he's persecuting Jesus ultimately. Verse 5, Saul answers, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. In different passages, Saul would actually go on to, or later on, Paul would talk about how he saw Jesus. So it's very clear that Saul would see Jesus somehow. Saul, I think, would very likely recognize Jesus, especially since Saul was on the Sanhedrin and part of the council that crucified Jesus. So I think Saul knew who Jesus was and recognized his face. And now he sees this resurrected Christ. And this is a little bit shocking for him, right? He hears a voice, he recognizes it as he says, "Who are you, Lord?" I think this is the first step. So there's two things that we have to ask, and one of those is, "Who are you, Lord?" When we're first not saved, first thing we need to understand is, "Who are you, Lord?" Who is Jesus? We got to come to terms that Jesus is the Christ. Acts chapter 5 says that. And we have to understand that Jesus is the Christ, and we have to follow and know that what he did on the cross is enough. So we see that this man Saul hits the ground, sees Jesus, and asks, "Who are you?" Like he knows who it is because he recognizes him, and he hears him, and he says, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting." But then he continues, Jesus talking, but rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. What's very interesting is these people didn't see Jesus, and they very likely didn't hear exactly what Jesus was saying. They just heard a booming voice from heaven. So Saul is told to rise and enter the city, and you will be told what to do. I believe that Saul was converted right here, right before this last verse where he says, "Who are you, Lord?" He recognizes that Jesus is the Lord, the Christ. He recognizes that. I think he was saved and converted right there. So verse 8, Saul rose from the ground. Although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. So this man, Saul, has an encounter with the risen Christ. He is brought to his knees, and now he is on a mission for God. God immediately changes this man's life radically. One of the most amazing conversion stories ever. This man Saul would go on to be one of the most influential men in all Christianity. We know more about theology and everything today from him than we do from anyone else. This man Saul is just, or would later be Paul, is just does such an incredible job. He would suffer for Christ. And yes, he one of the things he did is he caused people to blaspheme. You know, he regretted all that. I'm sure. This whole walk, it says for 3 days he was without sight, and on the rest of that walk, what do you think he was thinking about? I think there's also something to be said is how Jesus approached him. He says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" There's a lot of people who conjecture about the tone, but I would tend to think that Jesus, kind of like when he rebukes Peter, like, or when Peter hears the rooster crow 3 times after denying Jesus, there's love in his voice. He doesn't condemn. He shows love, and I think it's very similar with this man Saul. Instead of it being anger or whatever, I think it's more of a tone of a fatherly, like, "Saul, why are you doing this to me? Why are you persecuting me? Come on, man, you're better than this." Saul's a brilliant dude, before and after he was saved. He was still super smart. And as he's walking, he's like, "How did I miss it? How did I not realize that Jesus was the Christ? How could I not see it? Why was I so blind to the fact that it's all right in front of me, all the prophecy, all the fill in the blank, like there's so much evidence." He's like, "How did I miss it? How could I have done this and killed people and dragged them to prison where they're gonna die and done all this stuff?" He'll have dinner with people that he threw in prison or made leave Jerusalem, and he'll meet with these people, and he'll be in charge of teaching these people. It's just incredible, this journey that Paul's been on. But you can imagine, just as he's on his walk back, those words are probably ringing through his mind of, "Why are you persecuting me?" It's it's shocking. This man Saul has he has an encounter with the risen Christ, and it's just truly incredible. I think if it wasn't for this man Saul, and again, I think it's also showing that God can use even the worst of people. if anyone has a right to not become a Christian, it would probably be this man. Someone who is killing Christians left and right, dragging them away. He would call himself zealous against the way and, persecuting. But God says, no, I'm going to use you, Saul. I'm going to use you, whether you want to be used or not right now. And he has an encounter, right? He has an appointment with the Almighty. I think it's just a really, really cool story. And for 3 days, he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. And he's just in awe right now. I'm sure he's kind of in his, beating himself up a bit. But, ultimately, we're going to find out a lot more about him next couple weeks. This man, Saul, will really be our main focus for quite a while. The book of Acts, in general, is a lot about him because it's important. This man Saul, or Paul, is just such an amazing testimony. I think we can all relate to being lost in our sins, being zealous in our ways and our passions of the flesh, and coming to Christ, and it all kind of changing. They know us by our fruit, and I think if we're not showing that fruit, it can be very hard to actually become more like Christ. And if we're not showing that fruit, it can be hard for people to think that we are actually saved. I'm sure for a while, I think there was immediate change, obviously, in Saul's life, but I know for some people there was some doubt. Like, did he really? Is this fake? There's no way this man is a Christian now. So I'm sure there was some doubt, but God will use this man in such huge ways. There can be no doubt in anyone's mind. So we just got to be open and let God use us, and we got to make sure that we have to know who the Lord is. Right? Saul has this encounter. Who are you, Lord? He realizes Jesus is who he says he was. He is the risen Christ. He died for our sins so that we can spend eternity with him. We serve a powerful God, and he realizes that, and he gives his life to Christ. And now we are going to see just his testimony begin, and it starts here. So hopefully we can pick this up next week, and I'll see you guys later.